We start right in the present day with an elderly man named Paul Edgecombe. He's living in a nursing home, and one day a classic film comes on the TV. Well, this triggers this absolutely profound emotional reaction. He actually has to flee the room in tears. He ends up confessing to his friend Elaine that the past has finally caught up with him. And he starts telling her this story, a story he hasn't spoken a word about in over 60 years. Suddenly, we're transported all the way back to 1935, right in the middle of the Great Depression, when Paul was a prison guard supervising death row.
Now, Paul's story takes us to a place they called the Green Mile. Most prisons grimly referred to their death row as the last mile, right? But Paul and his fellow guards called their block the Green Mile simply because the floor of the corridor was the color of faded limes. And waiting at the very end of this mile was the electric chair, ominously nicknamed by both the guards and the inmates as Old Sparky. It was just a place completely defined by rigid routine and impending death, a seriously heavy burden for the men whose job it was to keep the peace.
But this grim, highly controlled routine, it abruptly shifts when a brand new inmate named John Coffey arrives. This guy is a man of monstrous, towering physical size, but his personality is literally the exact opposite of what you'd expect. He's remarkably meek, he's polite, and he even reveals that he's completely terrified of sleeping in a dark room. He actually tells Paul his name is spelled like the drink, only not spelled the same.
But here's the thing. The reason Coffey is on the mile is utterly horrifying. He was condemned to ride the lightning for the brutal murder of two little blonde girls. When a local posse found him, he was just holding their bloody bodies in his massive arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The posse and later the jury heard him repeating this one haunting phrase over and over. I tried to take it back, but it was too late. It honestly just seemed like an open and shut case of a monster caught red-handed.
Okay, so meanwhile, Paul is secretly dealing with the worst urinary infection of his entire life. It leaves him in absolute sheer agony. Then, one day, Coffey calls Paul over to his cell, just calmly saying he wants to help. Coffey reaches right through the bars, grabs Paul, and something impossible happens. A supernatural event. Coffey somehow absorbs the agonizing illness right out of Paul's body, and then he exhales the sickness into the air, almost like this swarm of dark, dying dust. Paul is instantly, miraculously cured, and he quickly realizes that this convicted child killer possesses an undeniable divine gift.
Now, the profound gentleness of Coffey's miracle is sharply contrasted by this one guard named Percy Wetmore. Percy's arrogant, mean, and honestly the only reason he even has a job is because he's the nephew of the governor's wife. One of the inmates, a guy named Delacroix, had actually adopted and trained this remarkably smart little mouse he called Mr. Jingles. Well, in an act of just pure malice, Percy stomps on the beloved pet, completely crushing it. But before the life totally leaves the creature, Coffey takes the bloody mouse into his massive hands, exhales the darkness, and miraculously resurrects it. He literally pulls the death right out of the tiny animal.
Now, to understand what happens next, you have to know that the guards maintain a strictly clinical procedure for executions. They even rehearse meticulously using a stand-in, just to ensure the real event is as humane and rapid as possible. They strap the inmate down, they apply a conductive wet sponge to the shaved head, which routes the electricity directly to the brain, they attach a black hood, and finally give the order to turn the generator on, a command they call roll on 2. It's a solemn duty, and Paul and his trusted men take it very seriously to minimize any suffering.
However, Percy ends up leveraging his political connections. He demands to lead an execution before he'll agree to transfer out of the prison. Paul reluctantly agrees, putting Percy in charge of Delacroix's execution. But Percy, out of pure spite, intentionally sabotages this meticulous process. He deliberately leaves that conductive sponge completely dry, so when the electricity hits, it doesn't kill Delacroix quickly at all. Instead, it results in a gruesome, agonizing, and fiery death. He essentially cooks the man alive in the chair, while the other guards are forced to watch the whole horrific spectacle play out.
Desperate to right the wrongs of the world, Paul learns that the warden's wife, Melinda, is dying of an inoperable brain tumor. So Paul forms this radical plan with his most trusted guards. They decide to risk their careers, and frankly their freedom, to drug a chaotic new inmate, lock Percy in the restraint room, and literally sneak John Coffey out of the prison in the dead of night. They load this giant, convicted murderer into a truck and drive him directly to the warden's home.
They bring Coffey right into Melinda's bedroom. She's suffering terribly, cursing in complete delirium. But when she sees Coffey, there is this moment of profound connection. Coffey leans in and successfully pulls the violent disease directly out of her head. But this time, it's different. The sickness is so massive, so incredibly dark, that Coffey can't exhale it. He holds it trapped inside his own massive body, choking and gagging on the disease, while Melinda immediately wakes up, totally healed, with a perfectly clear mind.
Choking on all that sickness, Coffee is rushed back to death row. The guards just barely manage to get him back into his cell before the morning shift arrives. But then, Percy foolishly walks a little too close to the bars. Coffee seizes the cruel guard with his incredible strength, and instead of exhaling that dark illness into the air, Coffee releases the massive, lingering brain tumor directly into Percy.
The supernatural sickness instantly shatters Percy's mind. Driven completely mad, with his eyes totally glassy and blank, Percy basically zombie walks down the Green Mile. He stops directly in front of the cell of Wild Bill Wharton, this incredibly chaotic, racist, and violent inmate who had caused nothing but trouble since the day he arrived. Without saying a single word, Percy draws his sidearm and empties his weapon into Wild Bill, killing the malicious inmate right then and there.
The guards are absolutely stunned. When Paul demands to know why Coffee targeted Wild Bill, Coffee just asks Paul to take his hand. And right there, Coffee shares a psychic vision, transferring his own memories directly into Paul's mind. Paul sees the horrific truth. Wild Bill was the true murderer of those two little girls. Bill had threatened to kill one sister if the other made a sound, essentially using their love for each other as a weapon. Coffee had only found the bodies and tried to heal them, but he was too late. This vision proves to Paul without a shadow of a doubt that John Coffey is entirely innocent.
So think about the position Paul is in now. He is left with an impossible moral dilemma. He is literally scheduled to flip the switch on an innocent man who clearly possesses a divine healing gift. Paul confesses to his wife that he feels he's in real danger of hell. He just cannot fathom standing before God and trying to explain why he destroyed one of his true miracles, simply because it was his job.
Feeling absolutely desperate, Paul goes to Coffee's cell and offers to look the other way, to let him escape. But Coffee stops him. He actually asks to be executed. Coffee explains that he's completely exhausted by the immense pain and cruelty he feels radiating from humanity every single day. He says he feels it like pieces of glass in his head. He's just so tired of people being ugly to one another, and he simply wants the pain to end. To him, the electric chair is a release.
And so the day of the execution inevitably arrives. As Coffee sits strapped into Old Sparky, he has one final request. He begs Paul not to put the black hood over his face because, remember, he's terrified of the dark. Looking out at the hateful, screaming parents of the dead girls, Coffee somehow finds a sliver of peace. As Paul gives the agonizing order to roll on too, ending the life of a true miracle, Coffee just softly sings to himself, "Heaven, I'm in heaven."
Then we return to the present day in the nursing home. Paul finishes telling this incredible story to Elaine, and he leads her out to a small shed in the woods to reveal a staggering secret. Paul is 108 years old. It turns out that when John Coffey grabbed Paul's hand to share that psychic vision, a part of Coffey's supernatural power spilled over into Paul. Coffey had inadvertently, as Paul puts it, infected him with life. Paul realizes that this unnatural lifespan is not a blessing at all. It is his ultimate punishment. It's his atonement for letting John Coffey ride the lightning. Paul is forced to helplessly watch his wife, his son, his friends, and eventually even Elaine grow old and die before him, leaving him entirely alone. Inside that shed, Paul reveals one more miracle. Mr. Jingles, the little mouse Coffey resurrected all the way back in 1935, is actually still alive, bearing that exact same supernatural spark. Paul endlessly walks his own Green Mile, accompanied only by this unnaturally immortal mouse. He just waits for a death that simply refuses to come, forever haunted by the memory of the miracle he helped destroy.
And so it leaves us with this heavy question to ponder as Paul waits alone in the dark. If you were forced to walk an endless mile while all your loved ones faded away into memory, would life itself become the ultimate curse?